Have you ever thought to yourself that there's got to be an easier way to manage your garden space? Maybe you have a kitchen garden and you always feel a little bit out of control. We can have really busy lives, and if you're looking for a way to create a little bit of a better work-life garden balance, this video is going to talk about how fantastic perennials are. If you're someone that likes to grow food, which is basically the only reason why I garden, I am driven by flavour, you'll be very pleased to know that perennials play an essential role in creating a resilient garden and give you a huge amount of opportunity to save money when done right. And I'll cover those in the 8 reasons in this video why I'm growing more perennials. But firstly, what is a perennial? A perennial is quite a broad term for a plant that grows anywhere more than 3 years. So 3 years is a short-lived perennial. Asturian tree cabbage is an example of that. But then you have things like soft fruit. These are red currants in front of me. These can grow for like 15, 20 years. But then you can have things like grapevines, which can easily grow over 100 years. So it's a very broad category. So I'm going to give you, I think, my favourite reason why you should consider growing more perennials first. And it's to do with cost, because you don't need compost to grow perennials. Perennials, they're not anywhere as close as hungry as annuals are. And so what that means is if you've got perennials like these are different herbs, you can just put in a load of mulch, plant them. The mulch is just going to gradually break down and add fertility to the soil. But I don't need to use expensive compost or homemade compost to mulch my perennials. Instead, what it allows me to do is to better prioritize the homemade compost for those hungry annual crops. And it actually opens up a lot of breathing space when it comes to adding fertility for these perennials. If the last point wasn't enough of a reason for you to start looking at implementing a lot more perennial planting in your garden, this next point should hopefully help. And it's the fact that perennials need far less water than annuals. And what that means is that perennials are more resilient when it comes to periods of dry weather. Unlike a lot of your annual plants, and they're all small seedlings and you're going around trying to keep them all alive, perennials, once they're in the ground, they're going to start forming really extensive root systems. They know that they're going to be grown for multiple seasons. And because of that much stronger root system, they can access the minerals, they can access the water from deeper down. And so they're a lot more of a hands-off kind of plant when it comes to hot weather. And if you really struggle to water your garden in your polytunnel, and I use things like soaker hoses, the idea this year is I have all of my seedlings and I will hand water those, that's fine. But as soon as anything goes in the ground in any of the polytunnels, they're just going to be irrigated by soaker hoses. I turn on one tap and it all gets watered. Now that's great for annuals, but if it's the outdoors and you don't have that kind of irrigation system, you will have to go around with a watering can or a hose pipe to keep things watered. But the perennials will be quite happy for an extended period of time without needing any extra additional water. I hinted at it in the last point about saving time, but the lovely thing about perennials is that you have a better balance of time throughout the calendar year. So if most of your garden is annuals, you're going to be very busy during spring, getting everything ready, pretty busy over summer, keeping on top of things, and pretty busy in autumn, harvesting and storing everything. The lovely thing though about perennials is that you don't need to do the seed sowing or the transplanting. Once they're in, they're in. Most of the attention that they need is in the off season, i.e. over winter, when you might want to give them a prune or give them a mulch ready for the upcoming growing season. And apart from a couple of exceptions, the only real time that they need your attention during the growing season is when it comes to harvesting. And so the greater proportion of your garden that's put over to perennials, the less time that you need to spend during the nicest weather trying to keep on top of everything. And so instead of it all being condensed in a few short months, perennials allow you to spread that quite intense workload over the year. And so there's always something to do in the garden. It gives you a nice excuse to go to the garden in winter as well, but it also means you have more time in summer to just sit back and relax and enjoy your space. There are many allotments in kitchen gardens that have really big slug issues, and sometimes it might feel no matter how hard you try, there's always a slug onslaught, and it can be a little deflating. So what you can do is admit defeat to the slugs for the annual section, But instead of not growing food, because food is food, you could then introduce a lot more perennials. My experience with perennials is slugs are just not interested. Slugs are not interested in the soft fruit that I grow. They're not interested in the majority of the herbs. They're not interested in the trees. They're not interested in the tubers. And I think it's because with perennials, their leaves tend to be a lot tougher, and slugs are after the annuals of fresh, like tender growth. But for perennials, we mostly don't grow them for the leaves. We grow them for the other harvests. And so instead, if you switch things around and you just grow a lot more perennials, suddenly your garden will be a success. Yes, you might not be growing the things that you had anticipated, but you flip that mindset to think, okay, I've got a problem here, let's look at a different direction. You introduce all the perennials, and then you have a nice productive garden that will also save you a lot of compost and a lot of time in the long run. And you're probably more likely to get really interesting things that you'll never see in a shop. As time goes on, I'm getting increasingly excited about just the sheer volume of flavours that I can grow here in the garden by introducing more perennials. This polytunnel last year was used to grow a lot of tomatoes, but I thought 2 polytunnels worth of tomatoes was a little overkill. And so what I've done is, instead of looking at maybe other annuals, I thought, what are flavours that I can't grow outside and I can't buy locally, but I could grow because of the help of some undercover? And so here I have an apricot tree. Here within this polytunnel, we've got apricot, nectarine, cherry, all self-fertile, and a pomegranate as well. And there's a few other things going in and going underneath. And so it's kind of just shifting again, thinking, okay, that would take a lot of my time if this is all under tomatoes. But I also want the garden to be a source of joy. And if I can come here and I can eat my own peaches and apricots and nectarines that I've grown, then that's got to be the coolest experience possible. And today I had a delivery, and it is Szechuan pepper and Nepalese pepper. These are trees that grow peppercorns. You can also use their leaves for fragrance as well. They're fully hardy, they grow outside, they're quite compact trees. And so then suddenly I'll be growing all of the pepper that I need. And that's exciting. The flavour, the sheer diversity of flavour in the perennial realm is incredible, and I can't wait to share a lot with you over the coming years. I grew up in the garden from the age of 3, but one of the things that absolutely got me just totally obsessed with plants was propagating perennials. It started off with soft fruit, like red currants, gooseberries, black currants. You just stick a stick in the ground during the dormant season and it grows into a new plant. But also things like comfrey, where you can just split it or divide it into quarters or into eighths, and then you plant each section of that plant and it creates a whole new plant. It is actually quite addictive in a good way, because if you have a new area and all of these plants have come from the old garden, then it's quite easy to expand that in terms of perennials. Some are a little bit harder, like apple trees. You need to do grafting and stuff. But you have to remember that those apple trees could live for, if they're dwarf, maybe 25 to 40 years. If they're older, they could live for well over 100 years. And so it isn't needed as much. But one of the most important things in a garden is looking at what kind of assets that you can create, that you can swap for other resources or barter or even sell. And because perennials, many of them are so easy to propagate, especially perennial herbs, you can use that to then swap with other plants and just have it as an asset to help in many other ways. One of the best benefits about perennials is that when you plant them, you never need to worry about soil compaction, because there's not going to be big areas of bare ground. This was the Wi-Fi garden. It's been through a bit of a transition. I need to move this rhubarb. I forgot about it. There was loads of strawberries underneath it, but most of it was annuals. And when you harvest annuals, you've then got bare ground, and it isn't always a good opportunity to put in a cover crop or something. And with the amount of rain we've been getting, that can lead to soil compaction, which can be a little bit of a pain, and it's usually remedied either by adding lots of organic matter or by broad forking, or ideally trying to do both of those. But when you plant a perennial, yes, some of them die back, but they naturally create a mulch, and you never have to worry about soil compaction when you're growing perennials. And I just think that that's another important thing to think about. Many annuals serve one core purpose, which is, say, spinach, you grow it for the leaves, and that's about that. It's an important purpose because you're feeding yourself, but the lovely thing about perennials is that they naturally are going to be, most of them, really, really good for wildlife and biodiversity. One of the most biodiverse areas are kind of old orchards with meadows underneath. Now this here is a crab apple and there's blossom, and that helps the pollinators, but any kind of perennial that you grow and you let it do its thing, you let it flower, like all of the perennial herbs. The perennial herb garden during kind of August is probably the most busy space in terms of insects and pollinators out of this whole garden. I'm trying to change that. I want this whole space to be busy, but it kind of proves it. It's a wonderful way to provide extra forage at different times of year as well. Like you've got it in the polytunnel, you've got the much earlier blossoms coming through, and so that is why you should also grow perennials, because the local wildlife is very much going to benefit. Now, of course, there are many annuals that you can grow that are fantastic for wildlife, and you can let some of your vegetables run to flower and it's going to benefit that. But if you're after a healthy, productive garden, it starts at the soil. And this video here shows you my no-nonsense practical guide to soil health, and it covers both annuals and perennials, and hopefully will help you get a nice, productive garden.